Alright guys, welcome to Geometry. Today is August 3rd, and we're going to start discussing today what are called conditional statements. Okay? So what is a conditional statement, right? A conditional statement is an if-then statement. That is comprised of two parts. A hypothesis and conclusion. Okay? Now here, when we say hypothesis, we're not talking about what you learn in science class as a hypothesis. Remember, science class, it's an educated guess based upon the data. In math, we call that a conjecture, right? So hypothesis here is what we have immediately following the if statement. So if, and then whatever comes after it is the hypothesis, then the conclusion. Okay? So we're going to take a look at just a common example. We're going to take a look at the Pythagorean theorem, which is written in if-then form, right? So here, by the way, I'm sorry, a few other things. The hypothesis, we usually use a P. In conclusion, we usually use a Q. And so then symbolically, we can represent this as P, arrow, Q. And this is read as P implies Q, or if P, then Q, right? So if P, then Q, or P implies Q. Okay? So that's what it's going to look like symbolically. Okay? So again, back to our idea here, the Pythagorean theorem, right? If you have a right triangle, then a squared plus b squared equals c squared, where c is the hypotenuse, right? Okay, so that's kind of the Pythagorean theorem, a little bit abbreviated. Now, often what's going to happen here is I'm going to ask you to underline the hypothesis and circle the conclusion, right? Now here, the words if and then should never be circled or underlined. They simply indicate where it is that we're looking, okay? So here, the hypothesis is you have a right triangle, all right? Then the conclusion would be a squared plus b squared when c is the hypotenuse, okay? So you can see here, underline the hypothesis, circle the conclusion, all right? Now, not all statements are going to be given to us in if-then form. So that's another skill that we need to have, right? So we saw last week, I kind of used this example where I said all men are mortals, right? Okay. So if all men are mortals, right, how do we write that as an if-then statement, right? So as an if-then statement would be if you are a man, comma, then you are mortal, right? So if we think about this, right, now I can see the hypothesis is just men, right? And the conclusion is mortals, right? So if you are a man, then you are a mortal, okay? So that's kind of what we're talking about here when we do these problems. So we've got two skills here. One is being able to identify a hypothesis and being able to identify a conclusion. And the second is being able to rewrite a statement in if-then form, okay? In class, we're actually going to practice. We're going to let you try doing a couple of these on your own, and we're going to compare answers, all right? Now, the next thing we want to be able to do with conditional statements is handle what are called related conditional statements, or related statements, right? So here, we've got this idea of a conditional statement. And the conditional statement we know is always going to be P implies Q, okay? Now there are three related conditional statements, okay? Your book handles them in a slightly different order than I do. Let me go ahead and take a look at your homework and see what it's going to ask you to do. Okay, so the first one we're going to take a look at is what's called the converse, all right? Now what a converse is going to do is it's essentially going to switch the statements P and Q, right? So for converse, you're going to have Q implies P, all right? So when you think converse, think of shoes. Most people do anyway, but think about them being on the wrong feet. So they're going to switch places, okay? Now the next one is called the inverse, okay? Now here, we've got P implies Q. For the inverse, we're going to have tilde P implies tilde Q, okay? Now, what is this tilde symbol here, right? This actually means negation, right? So tilde is negation, right? And it means the opposite of, right? So in our last one, we had if it is a right triangle. So the negation of that would be if it is not a right triangle, okay? We had if you are a man, the negation would be if you are not a man, right? So we've got this idea here of negation is the opposite, okay? And then finally, the last one is what's called the contrapositive. Okay? So here, the contrapositive is essentially the converse of the inverse, right? So this one's going to be tilde Q implies tilde P, okay? So the opposite of what was originally the conclusion implies the opposite of what was the hypothesis, okay? And we're actually going to talk about the truth table of these tomorrow, and hopefully we find some things that are pretty interesting, okay? So these are related conditionals, all right? And we're going to take a look at a statement, and we're going to go ahead and find all the related conditionals, the converse, the inverse, and the contrapositive, right? We're going to keep it pretty simple, right? So our conditional statement is going to be if you study, then you will pass. Okay, very simple, right? So if that's our conditional statement, the first thing I'm going to encourage you to do is to always identify P, you study, and then Q, you will pass, all right? So now we can go ahead and we can find our related conditionals, right? So the first one we're going to do is we're going to find the converse, all right? Now for the converse here, we simply switch P and Q. And you can change the tense if you want, but it's essentially going to be if you passed, then you studied. Right? I just made it past tense so it flowed a little easier, but you don't necessarily have to do that, right? So if you passed, then you studied. What I want you to notice, the word if did not move, the word then did not move. Simply the statements P and Q moved, all right? Now we're going to take a look at the inverse, right? Now the inverse, I keep everything the same, but I negate it. So this is going to be if you don't study, right, then you will not pass. Okay? So again, here you have to negate it. And we usually negate it by adding the word not or taking away the word not if it's already there. Okay? If you double negate something, if you don't study, that would be if you study again, right? So we can either add or subtract the word not, some sort of negation. All right? So there's our inverse. Okay? Now for the contrapositive. I'm just going to call that one contra, right? Here, I'm essentially going to take the converse of the inverse, right? Or the inverse of the converse, however you want to say it. So here I'm going to say if you didn't pass, then you didn't study. And so this is the last skill we're going to learn today. So taking a conditional statement and finding the three related conditionals, the converse, the inverse, and the contrapositive. Remember, with converse, think of your shoes but on the opposite feet. Inverse is just the opposite, so you negate both the hypothesis and the conclusion. And the contrapositive is a combination of the inverse and the converse. It's the converse of the inverse or the inverse of the converse. Okay? So that's going to be your homework tonight. And again, in class, we're going to practice a few of these together. Email me if you have questions.